King, comfort of the Spirit, true to give word, President, fill us all things, treasure, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. So tonight we're going to get into the 18th century. And 17th century had was a complicated mess, especially in Russia. It was certainly a mess in the Byzantine world, and Western Europe was trying to settle down and figure out what had happened with the Protestant Reformation as churches started to multiply and doctrines and all sorts of ideas, and then you had going into the 18th century, you had the beginnings of the Enlightenment, which by the end of the 18th century led to chaos. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and in the meantime, in Russia, the 18th century was actually a very progressive period for the most part. It starts off pretty much with Peter the First, who was born in 1672, and by the turn of the century was was fully in command and starting some massive Western reforms. He had been schooled in Western Europe. He'd gone to the Netherlands, spent extensive amounts of time in Netherlands, in Germany, in Switzerland, where he was exposed to all sorts of ideas, and so he brought those back to Russia as the Tsar. And sometimes when he went to the West, he would try to go incognito, but that was really difficult because he was 7 feet tall. Wow. And so there weren't too many people who were 7 feet tall roaming around Europe at the turn of the 18th century. So it was his incognito didn't really work. So people that knew they were dealing with somebody of substance. And so he was very impressed by what was going on in Western Europe. Then he came back to Russia and felt that it was extremely backwards. And so he set about to westernize and to remedy that so-called backwardness, and to bring Russia up to the modern times. Part of this included, and I'm going to more focus on the ecclesiastical aspect, his dealings with the church, but he was also very much involved. Okay, over you. We talked about Peter the Great. Peter was also very much involved in the expansion of Russia, and was involved in various and sundry wars and conquests and a kind of consolidation of Russia's rule over its area. He ran into there were two primary enemies that plagued Russia in that era. One was the Ottoman Empire, and to the south, then there were the Swedes, and and then there were other groups that other political entities that also caused problems. Peter wanted to make Russia a great maritime power, and when he took the reins, the only port that it had was Arkhangelsk, which is a long way to the north and frozen half the year, and especially with the technology then. So he engaged in various wars with the Swedes and was able to take the area around the Baltic Sea and founded his new capital of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was basically built on a swamp. Sounds familiar.
Like Washington?
Just like Washington. It was, but it was built, and it was built with slave labor, essentially. Only it was Ukrainian slaves, or Ukrainians who were imported for the task of doing the manual labor of filling in the swamp and building the buildings and, you know, and creating a great European-style capital. And to this day, there's resentment in Ukraine against St. Petersburg. And the city was founded on former Swedish territory. So he kind of, by establishing his capital city there, he kind of rubbed it in that, that he had taken this from them, and and there was no way they were going to get it back. There's another empire which was already beginning to wane, and that was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so-called. Unless you know East European history, I don't think one normally thinks of Lithuania as ever having much influence in European history. But at the time when they combined with Poland to create essentially an empire, it was a very powerful Roman Catholic force. The Lithuanians, I believe, were the last pagan people among among the Europeans, and their language is something utterly and completely unrelated to anything else. It's one of these European languages that's very hard to learn. However, Polish, of course, is just a Western dialect of Slavic, and so that made things a little bit easier. And so when the Poles overran large parts of Ukraine and large parts of other Slavic lands, they kind of spoke the language. But part of Peter's goal was to roll back the Polish-Lithuanian conquest and to take back lands for Orthodoxy. He also did battle with the Persian Empire, and because to the east of the Black Sea is the Persian Empire, and so there were skirmishes there. It wouldn't be until Catherine that there were major conquests down there from the Persian Empire. Whose is that? Is the front door open?
I don't know. Look through the back.
Crimea was taken by Peter and retaken by Catherine, actually.
Right.
They've been fighting over it for like, what, 250 years or something like that.
Well, yeah, basically it's
swapped and swapped.
Yeah, it went back and forth. That whole area went back and forth, and then Catherine finally consolidated the gains, basically taking the whole north coast of the Black Sea.
And, another interesting thing, the first fleet was actually built on the Caspian Sea, not in St. Petersburg.
Mm-hmm.
And the beer chopping. That was the biggest thing.
Well, I'm getting there. Okay. I'm getting there. Yeah. So Peter was involved in all these various kinds of wars and attempting to consolidate the social political position of Russia as a European power, and engaging the Europeans, especially the Swedes and the Poles, and which would give him status within Europe, plus maintaining all these relationships with, especially with the Netherlands. One of the biggest adversaries, in a sense, that he confronted was the church. Although he was an Orthodox Christian, he saw the Orthodox Church as something profoundly backwards and a very negative kind of, or having a very negative effect on Russian society. So one of the things, as Oleg mentioned, was he instituted a beard tax. That if you wanted to have a beard, you had to pay 100 rubles a year. Now, 100 rubles at that time was a lot of money.
So as a status symbol.
It was the equivalent of thousands of dollars, so there were very few who were able to maintain their beards. Now, within the clergy, I don't know how much of that applied, but certainly for the laity, and especially for the nobles, which is who it was really directed at. I'm sure the peasants were exempt from that kind of a thing, because they would never see 100 rubles in their whole life. Peter's probably most significant actions regarding the church were that he abolished the patriarchate. The patriarch died, and he was never replaced. Instead, what he did is he instituted a Lutheran system where there was a Holy Synod of bishops, and the head of the Holy Synod of bishops was an Oberprocurator, who was a layman. All the decisions had to go through the Holy Synod of bishops. He put tremendous restrictions on monasteries. He forbade anyone under 50 from entering a monastery, which of course was incredibly destructive to monasticism. He began the confiscation of monastic lands. He closed monasteries, and it was a very difficult time.
Who was the last patriarch who died at that time?
I don't remember.
Oh.
I want to say Jeremiah, but I'm not sure. So this system of the Oberprocurator lasted through Nicholas II, and it was only when the church was freed from the Romanov domination that it was able to return to a canonical order, and that was actually the first order of business. There had been plans for it, there had been under discussion for many years, but it was not permitted to, the council was not permitted to happen. So, and so very soon after Nicholas abdicated, the council was called of 1917, an ill-fated council. Another thing that he did, which is quite interesting, is that he brought all sorts of Ukrainians in to the Russian church. And he populated the clergy, especially the higher clergy, with Ukrainians.
Why?
Because they were more open to reform. And than the Russians. The Russians were more conservative, and the Ukrainians were more reform-minded. Now, if you think about church reform, we talked about it in the last week. Russia had been going through all sorts of church reform for 60, 70 years. And so it was a very it was, shall we say, a touchy subject. You'd had the Stoglov Council, you had the Zealots of Piety, and then you had the Niconian reforms and the Old Believer Schism, and and then the execution of some of the leaders of the Old Believers. Mm-hmm.
He was like tortured like crazy. I mean,
it was a horrible thing.
Oh,
and
he was not the only one, by the way.
No, not at all. But there was, and so there still remained a rather brutal side to Russia at that time. But the church basically was, its life was very much hampered by Peter, even though Peter claimed to be a pious Orthodox. Maybe in kind of a reform, not a reformed in the sense of Protestant, but in a kind of modernist sense.
But he didn't change the theology, he didn't change the liturgy. I mean, not having a patriarch, I don't know, it doesn't concern me. If there is a patriarch or there is none, I mean...
Well, what it does, what it did was it disrupted the traditional way that the Russian Orthodox Church was operating.
Yeah, but what about just the believer?
Well,
what changed to the believer besides the beard?
The lives of the believers. Monasticism was closed to most people. There were fewer monasteries. It was people would go to monasteries, and the monasteries had a tremendous social service role. Those monasteries that had been responsible basically for feeding and for the welfare of the serfs that were under their ownership were suddenly unable to pay their bills and unable to care for the people that they were entrusted.
So the situation of the people was worse during his king.
Yes, it was. So, but this basically sets the stage. There were a couple of other czars following Peter, but then Catherine II. Peter was followed by his wife Catherine I. Then I think there was Peter
Alexander?
Peter II, who was the husband of Catherine I, and she had him bumped off, basically.
Somebody killed his own son. I mean, besides Peter the Great.
Oh, that wasn't Peter the Great. That was.
No, that's Ivan. No, but Catherine. No, some.
No. Peter executed his own son. That's true. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, he did. He did. Alexis.
And Catherine did. I mean, they are so good, those tsars, being Christians.
There was a common thing there back then.
Yeah, well,
it doesn't count.
all this dynastic stuff.
But his big thing was he brought in vodka to Russia. That was
He did?
Yeah.
He brought vodka to Russia.
From where?
I think it was Holland, Netherlands. Is the right way of saying it?
Probably.
Yeah, and then the Mendeleev,
That
the guy
worked
who did
well.
the
That
periodic
worked pretty
table, he established the 40% standard. No, that's a true story. Peter was the guy who, because vodka wasn't drinked in Russia, it was mead.
Mead,
Mead was
that's right.
the drink of, was the alcohol all the time.
Yeah.
And probably beer of some kind.
Beer, yeah, I mean beer probably, but the mead, the honey drinks, they were big in Russia. Until Peter.
Медовуха, да?
Медовуха, да. Until Peter got in with a really bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, in the monastic world, they look at Peter as the first persecutor of the church.
There was also one time that, one of the holidays, it was famous for people having social unrest, and because on that day they would be forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter was first to actually, execute everybody who went out. I forget what holiday it was, but I think in 1680 something, they had the big, they had like a big 2,000 people revolution or something because of the social and economical, situation. People were unhappy, and Peter wasn't so merciful.
No.
Like thousands were executed.
Well, there was a time of social unrest.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, he had like, I think before he took St. Petersburg, he had like a 40,000 people army or something like that. I mean, the army back then was basically your life's duty. You left and you didn't really come back.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know, probably not a great time to live.
No. No, especially if you're a Ukrainian peasant.
Yeah. Indian peasant.
Imported to St. Petersburg. Yeah. So anyway, the stage was set for Catherine. She was born in 1762 and she was born in 1729 and began her reign in 1762. She was born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, and she was born a Lutheran, and until in 1744 she became Orthodox, with the expectation that she would be marrying the future Russian Tsar. Of course, in 1744 she was 15. She was also a major Westernizer, and was enamored with the Enlightenment. But she became a great patron of arts, literature, education, law, and banking. And while she was a convert to Orthodoxy, having grown up, basically in a German context, she became, and she did everything she could to convert herself to being Russian. She learned Russian. She and spoke it fluently. She learned the culture. She learned the customs. She did everything she could to adapt to the culture. But while she was nominally Orthodox, she was evidently personally rather less than interested in religion. And so it was no big thing for her that she closed hundreds of monasteries.
She did too?
Yeah. She secularized and confiscated lands, both of monasteries and of churches, so that the clergy had to farm for a living. Either that or they started charging for sacraments. And we still have that with us,
Yes.
in some places. And it's a horrific abuse where you go into a church and you see
Menu.
a menu, essentially. Baptism, X number of rubles, dollars, whatever. Chrismation this,
That
marriage
we didn't have
this,
indulgence,
this.
right?
What's that?
Never used indulgence, like buying, selling your sins. Indulgence.
Indulgences. No.
Indulgences.
This is something
We never
else.
used
The Greeks did
did?
indulgences.
Oh.
Actually,
I
for a
think-
while.
Wasn't it the Catholic Church that was big on, buy absolution, buy
Yes.
salvation?
Well, I think it's a great fundraiser.
Yeah.
If you have a menu for each sin.
Yeah, you're taken out of purgatory. You know, it's your chip that you can hand to the demon as you go up the toll houses.
So what would they pay for receiving the gifts?
To go to communion, I don't know. They certainly would for confession. To go to communion, and at the time, people were only going to communion once or twice a year. Now, I think it was in the 19th century that it was legislated that you had to go to communion at least once a year if you were going to maintain a civil service job, and you had to present a card or a verification that you had gone to confession and communion, signed by a priest that year. So essentially, what happened is it created corruption in the church. Of course, this whole system of removing the patriarch, in other words, removing any kind of challenge to the imperial authority, you know, it was started out as a double-headed eagle. You know, the one head bit off the other, essentially, and that became a disaster. Now, on the other hand, he also used Christianity as a kind of a weapon, as it were, against the Turks. And he would, you know, they would take Muslim prisoners, or they would have Muslim employees, and even soldiers, and they would be given great bonuses if they would convert to Christianity. And prisoners of war would get time off or easy duty, and it was all sorts of things. So that Catherine became a great protector of orthodoxy, which is problematic. Also, it was not just in regards to the Turks. It was in regards to the Poles, who were Roman Catholic, and so they were given great bonuses if they would convert to Orthodoxy, and especially in the army and the nobility and all of that kind of stuff.
She liked Voltaire. She was in.
Yeah. She loved the Enlightenment, and she loved Voltaire, and she invited him to Russia, and I believe he actually spent the end of his life in Russia.
He died
He
in
was
Russia.
there. I don't know if he died there, but he was there.
Yeah, yeah. For years, she was his great patron. She was also provided refuge for the Jesuits, which is very interesting. A piece of history, because the Jesuits were being persecuted within the Roman Catholic Church, and the papacy actually deauthorized the Jesuit order, but they took refuge under Catherine the Great in Russia. And we were having.
They did a lot of good.
And they did a lot of good education and universities and things like that.
Jesuit what?
The Jesuits.
Jesuit.
Can you?
The Jesuits are a religious order that came out of the Counter-Reformation of Roman Catholicism to do battle against Protestantism, and they also were used in the Catholic battle against Orthodoxy. However, Jesuits, even then, being kind of arrogant, got themselves into all sorts of trouble. And so the Pope decommissioned the Jesuit order. So it was abolished. I believe, did you ever see the movie The Mission about the Jesuits in South America? I believe that's part of the context of that movie, the Jesuit order being abolished and so forth. We had dinner at a Chinese restaurant this evening, and there was a guy that looked very familiar at the next table, the professor at Georgetown. And so we got to talking, and he said, "Well, you know that Georgetown was a Russian university, right?" And I said, "No, I didn't know about that." Well, in 1789, Georgetown applied to the U.S. Congress for a charter. But since the papacy had decommissioned the Jesuits, they had no standing because they were not viewed as a legitimate order of the Catholic Church. And so the president of the university went to St. Petersburg and presented the case to Catherine. And so Georgetown received a Russian charter.
That's fun.
That's interesting.
And it was to start universities over there too.
Yeah, and then and part of the deal was they would start universities over there, and they just wouldn't pay any attention to what the Pope said. Of course, Catherine, being Orthodox, wouldn't pay much attention to what the Pope said anyway.
So Georgetown's really Russian.
That's right. So
Its origin.
yeah. He also said that their tuition now is $74,000 a year.
Yeah.
Very cheap.
It's unbelievable. So that was that's a kind of an interesting historical note. Of course, the American Revolution was during Catherine's reign, as was the French Revolution. So she was very aware of the power of the ideas of the Enlightenment, and while at first she liked them, eventually she became afraid of them. And so one of the things that happened is that she had somehow gotten herself into a position of being the protector of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which of course was Roman Catholic. But there was a kind of a democratic uprising within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which she wanted to squash. And so she came up with a plan with her friends and relatives, the King of Prussia and the King of Austria, and they partitioned Poland so that it no longer existed. So, part of it was given to the Prussians, part of it was given to the Austrians, most of it was taken by the Russians. Which I'm sure they thought was only poetic justice after the whole Uniate issue of the 16th through the 18th, 17th century, and actually most of the 18th century. She's the one who finally annexed Crimea and southern Ukraine and the Caucasus. She secured access to the Black Sea and established some cities, Odessa and Kherson, and several others. She was involved with and those were the Russo-Turkish wars. She was involved with Persian wars in which the Caucasus and Russia took much of Azerbaijan, and were getting ready to invade Iran itself, but it never happened, never came to pass. She was involved in the wars of succession in Bavaria, and she was involved in war with the Swedish Empire. So it was not exactly a very peaceful time, and it certainly was not a really, it was certainly a bad time for the church. However, within that context came something that I think is actually, of course, much more to my interest and knowledge and background, and that is the mission, first the colonization and then the missionization of Alaska. Ever since the 16th century, Russia had been gradually expanding across Siberia. In the 17th century and throughout the 18th century, there were all sorts of expeditions going not only through Siberia, but also around the North Pacific. Yeah.
I think it was her or Peter who discovered the Lake Baikal. I think it was her.
Personally? I don't think
no,
personally.
Not personally.
Yeah,
but,
it was under their reign.
Yeah,
Under their
I don't
reigns.
remember when it was, but that
Yeah.
was a big discovery. And then about Catherine, she was also, there was the lady, Saltykova, Pomeshchika Saltykova. She was big on torturing her peasants. Catherine, and until she had no punishment until somebody finally wrote to Catherine, and she was supposed to be executed, and Catherine forgiven her and put her into some hole for like 20, where she survived like 20 years, which was crazy because nobody lasted there longer than a year. But it's a big story. She was actually the one who I think gave peasants some rights.
Yeah, actually, she did. She did give peasants some rights. She gave them a right of appeal to and she gave the nobility responsibility for the peasants in their area, so that they could go, the peasants could go to them instead of coming to her, because she didn't want to deal with the peasants.
No, but with this case, like they had to, because all the complaints, they were just shut down, and those who complained got killed. I mean, the lady was brutal. Like, her thing was for some reason to torture her young girls that were peasants. There's a great movie about it that came out recently. I mean, it's in Russian. It's called Krvavая Barыня, the Blood Baroness or something like that. Yeah, but it's historic, and I mean, she's famous. You know, it's part of the history. And Catherine was, again, it's a big mystery why and how she was forgiven. Because I mean, hundreds of people probably should get executed, but Catherine somehow.
Well, there's a million stories, and I'm no expert in this. I mean, and this is basically political history, but it's the ecclesiastical history that I've been the most interested in.
Did you say when Alaska was started to
I was getting
bring Orthodoxy into Alaska?
Yeah, well, the first Russian explorers got there in 1741. And in July of 1741, the first liturgy was celebrated in Alaska on a boat off of Mount St. Elias on St. Elias Day. In 1784, Gregory Sholokov established a colony at Three Saints Harbor, which is Old Harbor on Kodiak, which is, I believe, on the northeastern side of Kodiak. This eventually was found not to be the best location for the capital of the colony, and so they eventually moved it around to the southwestern corner of the island, where the city of Kodiak now sits. Um, during this time, which was dominated by the Russian-American company, there were also, just as there had been throughout Siberia, pромышленники, which were basically kind of half explorers, half merchants, you know, going around and investigating the resources, taking what resources they could carry, and selling them. When they got to Alaska, they found that there was incredible rich resources of seals, of fur seals, of sea otters, of all of the you know, the furs that came off of the mainland, and so they were wanting to exploit these. Now, it's very interesting the contrast of how the Russians dealt with the natives as opposed to the Spanish in California down the coast. The Spanish basically didn't view them as human, and though they would baptize them, they basically enslaved them, and some of them they just killed. And I'm sure there were also probably undoubtedly many deaths because of diseases, epidemics that would sweep through. But it was a very sorry experience for the native Californians to be enslaved by the Spanish, when they were converted to Catholicism, the Mass remained in Latin. All of the instruction remained in Latin. There was no communication of Christianity to the natives. So what happened is that a kind of a syncretic system evolved that had Catholic forms, but native pagan content, and this happened throughout Spanish America.
I mean, the Spanish, what I heard is the influence came early because when they came in, they saw like Aztecs doing ritual sacrifices, and that was, you know, against Christianity. So they figured, you know, these people are just wild, you know, they just no.
Well, it's.
But that's, I mean, that was like 200 years before the time you're talking about.
Right.
Now.
So that history, I mean, that history is very interesting. The Spanish, Columbus first arrived in the West Indies, and eventually the main colony was developed in Santo Domingo, basically, and then eventually they came to Mexico, where they landed in Veracruz, and there's a pass through the mountains that only goes up to about 11,000 feet before you can get into the Valley of Mexico. Well, the coastal plain was heavily settled, and they weren't Aztecs, but you know, some of the people were allies of the Aztecs, and others were enemies of the Aztecs. But you know, they were in the sphere of influence of the Aztec Empire, which was at its height when the Spanish arrived. And so the Spaniards came to Mexico, and they heard about this Moctezuma, the Aztec king, and decided they had to go and to conquer his sea. Well, there were like 200 Spaniards, 150 Spaniards, but they had horses and they had armor. And so the arrows would bounce off, the arrows would break, you know, the arrow tips, the stone arrow tips would break, and then there was also the shock factor that the Native Americans had never seen horses before, or any beast of burden. And at first they didn't realize that horses and Spaniards were two separate beings. They thought that it was one kind of great monster. So that, of course, that didn't last very long. But they also brought with them smallpox and the flu, and this just swept like wildfire through the native population.
They got a lot of gold from them.
Right. The Aztecs in particular had a lot of gold, and gold to the Aztecs was like aluminum foil is to us. You know, it's nice, it's shiny, you can do pretty things with it. You can cover walls and windows with it, and it's shiny, and it's nice, you know. But they didn't think they thought it was essentially worthless because there was so much of it, and it's just. And so but of course the Spaniards were possessed by greed when they heard about the what was, you know, the amount of gold and the treasures, and they would see little examples of it here and there, and so they eventually got across the mountains and met Moctezuma. They saw Tenochtitlan, which was the city that is now Mexico City, but it was this. It was on islands in the middle of a lake with causeways. It was whitewashed. It was beautiful. It was like 5 stories plus the pyramids, and they'd never seen anything like that. The biggest building in Europe was 3 stories tall. It had running water. It had sewage pipes. It the natives, the Native Americans bathed every day. The Spanish bathed once a year if they needed it, whether they needed it or not. Of course, the Spanish were hairy, and the Native Americans were hairless, and so they wondered what kind of monkeys these were, you know, these pale monkeys, so it was quite a culture clash, and then eventually what happened is the Spanish imprisoned Moctezuma, and although the Aztecs tried to free him, most of them were so sick that they couldn't fight, and many of them were just literally dying in their beds. The diseases brought by the Europeans had a 95% mortality rate, and within 50 years, the population of the Valley of Mexico went from 25 million to 500,000. So, if you could imagine.
How many years you said?
Within 50 years, because the disease would sweep through in waves. You know, some people would have a degree of immunity, others would develop immunity, but then others had no immunity at all, and they would be swept away. And, then there were the orphans and the elderly. And horrible.
So, but what happened in Alaska?
Well, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. So, so this same pattern of the Europeans arriving, bringing diseases, conquering and mistreating the native people, became an overall pattern throughout North America, and especially in the Spanish areas. The English did it. The English and the other North Europeans did it too, but it wasn't. It was slightly different. The English didn't enslave the natives like the Spanish did, and so when the Russians arrived in the 1780s, they employed the natives. They preached the gospel. They baptized them. They were lay baptisms, but they baptized them, and many of the Russian fur traders took native wives. So it was in very a small amount of time, you had a biracial, bicultural society that was growing in the midst of what had been Aleut society, primarily Aleut. And then
there was not such a cultural difference like between Spanish and Aztecs.
there was a huge cultural difference.
No, the difference I mean between the Russian and the one living in Alaska. I mean,
No, there
it's
was
the
a
same
huge,
kind. There was.
it was a huge cultural difference. Yeah, Aleuts are a type of they're more closely related to Eskimos.
Like Chukchi. Chukchi.
Yeah.
So
And
they're Russian kind of too, or they were
No,
not.
no. It's a totally
Empire.
different culture. But one of the things that when a person was baptized in Alaska by the Russian American company, they became a Russian subject. Whereas I believe the natives in California, for example, or in other places, did not become Spanish subjects. They didn't have rights. Whereas the natives in Alaska had rights, and so even though the Russians could be very brutal to them, they still paid them for their work, and they still were free to go if they wanted to, for the most part. Yeah.
There's also a story I heard when there was a priest, some Alaskan saint, that came in on the boat. The Eskimos, who never met him, their shaman said, you know, come to the shore, there'll be a guy here who knows more about God than I can ever tell you.
Yeah. Saint Innocent. We'll get there. That's about 1830.
Okay.
Okay, we're in 1780.
Okay.
Okay.
But I like that one.
So, in 1793, a mission was put together by the Archbishop of St. Petersburg, who was essentially he was one of the senior hierarchs on the Holy Synod, of course with the blessing of the Empress, and they got recruited 10 monks from Valon, which had been newly reestablished 10 years earlier, and they took several hierer monks, some hierer deacons, and a couple of simple monks. One of the simple monks was Saint Herman. The head of the mission was an archimandrite, Yosaf, and then there was hierer monk Juvenali and others. And it took them a year to trek across Siberia, and they part of it they walked, part of it they went by boat, part of it they were on some kinds of carts, but it took a whole year to get to the Pacific coast. And from the Pacific coast, they took a ship going to Alaska, where they were deposited in Kodiak, and there proceeded to build a church. Holy Resurrection Church is still there to this day, and they built a monastery and had that which was their headquarters, and their mission was to convert the Americans, and the Americans consisted were people at that time who spoke Yupik and Aleut and Tlingit and all these other native languages, but there were also those strange people who spoke English and other languages who would come through from time to time. Now the Russian mission basically focused on central Alaska, and I'll talk about the Russian mission in much more detail. Maybe later, but probably next week.
There are a lot of old believers there, right?
Yeah, but that's not until the 20th century. Who fled from the Soviets.
No.
But Um, broke my train of thought.
It focused on Central.
Oh yeah, the Russian mission focused on Alaska, and so so there was Saint Herman was who was a simple monk, but who was an elder and was kind of the spiritual foundation of the mission there. Writes that he was very encouraged hearing two monks argue as to which part of Alaska they would get to evangelize. And one of those was Juvenali, who was a priest monk, and he ended up going to the headwaters of the, I believe, of the Yukon River. They talk about him going to Lake Iliamna, but that's there's no memory of that in the local people. But there is the memory of him coming to the Yupiks on that lower peninsula that's defined by the Yukon on the north and the Kuskokwim on the south, and that's Yupik territory. The Yupiks are Eskimos. There's two major Eskimo groups: the Yupiks and the Inupiat. The Inupiat are Barrow and North, and they tend to be either pagan or Protestant of some kind, and a few Catholics. And whereas the Yupik are mostly Orthodox, but not because of Saint Juvenali, because Saint Juvenali got there and he was going through the down the river, and the local shamans spotted him, and they saw that he was wearing a chain with a cross on it, but it had a chain, and only shamans could wear chains in their culture. So they thought he was a foreign shaman invading their territory, and so they killed him and chopped him up. So there are no relics of Saint Juvenali, but the people remembered. And when a local girl from another village married an anthropologist who's also a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest. They went to the village where Saint Juvenali had suffered, and the people were very ashamed, and they admitted that yes, they had done that dastardly deed 200 years ago. But Saint Juvenali is the first martyr in America. Archimandrite Yosef and a hieromonk and a hierodeacon, after 3 years there, took a report back to St. Petersburg, and of course it was quite a trek back to St. Petersburg, and then coming back. And the report basically consisted that the Russians were horrifically maltreating the natives, and that the missionaries had gone on strike and would not do anything for the Russians. They wouldn't marry them, they wouldn't bury them, they wouldn't baptize their children, they wouldn't do anything for them. They were there to serve the Americans and not the Russians. And the Russians were behaving too badly to be dealt with, and unrepentant. And so Archimandrite Yosef was consecrated a bishop with the title of Alaska, and was sent back, and he and his companions arrived 2 or 3 years later, and their ship sank within sight of land. So all hands were lost. So one could class him almost as a confessor of the faith. Most of the other missionaries died in Alaska. A couple went back, but most of them died in Alaska. St. Herman was the last of them, who persevered there until 1837. And he withdrew to Spruce Island, away from Kodiak, to an island across the channel, where he could have peace and quiet and minister to the natives, and where he wasn't involved in all the politics of the Russian colony. So part of the whole Russian colony was that it was actually more an action or an activity of the Russian American Company, which was like the Hudson Bay Company, which was essentially a commercial merchandising company that exploited the wealth of Alaska and took it back and sold it in Russia, especially the furs and anything else they could get that was of value. Olga, thank you very much. There was not a lot of Russian government presence, imperial presence there in Kodiak. I think there was ultimately a little bit later on, when it came time, when the capital was moved from Kodiak to Sitka, and Sitka was established as a much larger city. And certainly, as a bishop, the first bishop there was St. Innocent. There was much more of a kind of official presence, which would mean an imperial presence, because he was an officer of the state.
Have you been there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been all over Alaska, southern Alaska. It's pretty amazing.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stories about the missionaries and the mission. And then when you get a little bit later into the 19th century, you get Saint Innocent and Saint Yakov Nitzvetov, who labored many years in that in the Alaskan communities. And the missionary method that they used was something also quite extraordinary, especially in relation to what the Spanish were doing. So 1794 was when the mission was established, but the Russians had gotten to Alaska in 1741, and they proceeded to explore all the way down the coast. In the early 1760s, Junipero Serra was authorized by the Spanish and by his superiors in the Franciscan order to start a chain of missions up the coast of California in order to stop the Russians. And it specifically was that was the specific reason given in his orders, was to stop the Russians from taking California. As it was, basically, it was Russian territory from just above the Golden Gate northwards, and it was Spanish territory southwards. And if you go to Sonoma, to Mission Sonoma, which was the northernmost mission, and walk into the visitor center, you see they have a wall painting of a Spanish friar and a Russian Orthodox priest monk facing off, and that was the border between the Russian colony and New Spain, as that part of the Spanish Empire and then later Mexico was called.
So the colonization was exclusively religious, or they had fight there? Did they fight there? I mean, it's colonization.
No,
They
the
occupied.
colonization, for the Russians was primarily mercantile. It was primarily the establishment of trading.
Okay, so they
posts.
just went there and did
But
business.
They went there, did business, bought furs and had them processed and sent them. But in the meantime, they also had to establish towns that did farming and which would support their activities. And so there was their fort was on the coast of Sonoma County, which is an impossible place to grow much of anything because it's too cool and foggy. But you go into the valley a few miles, and you've got paradise, and you can grow anything. And so there were the agricultural settlements, and then there was the fort, and the same pattern happened. The Russians married into some of the local, both native and Spanish settlers. The Russians eventually abandoned Fort Ross and sold it, but there were many people. There were locals who were baptized there as Orthodox Christians. And there was a cemetery there where there were hundreds and hundreds of people buried. I was present when the archaeologists were excavating that cemetery, and then was present for the reburial of what was left. Now there wasn't much left. A few teeth, maybe, was basically all that was left.
I've been there. I don't remember a cemetery. I don't know.
Remember the big cross on the?
There is a
There's a
cross.
huge
Yeah,
cross.
there is a cross. Yes,
That's the cemeteries around it, and each of the graves has a 3-bar cross. So it's very moving. Every year at least the OCA, I'm sure the other jurisdictions too would go there. The OCA on the 4th of July would do liturgy in the chapel of the fort, which is the oldest church building in the continental United States, oldest Orthodox church building, and then would go to the cemetery and do a panakida.
It's called Fort Ross, R-O-S.
Fort Ross.
Fort Ross. Yes, it's north of San Francisco.
Yeah, Fort Rosia. It's about 70 miles north of San Francisco on Highway 1. Yeah.
So I was wondering if I could ask a question backing up to Alaska about the Orthodox missionaries that came over, the monks. Were there a lot that drowned? Or was it just a couple? Or
No. There were the 3 who drowned, but the rest died otherwise.
in the water? Or
There were the 3 who drowned on the boat coming back with the bishop, the priest, and the deacon.
I see.
They drowned. The others, I don't know the history of each one, but they died in their missionary work.
So is this missionary work, you're saying the Russians were there for the goods?
That's initially why they came. Then they sent the church mission, which was specifically to baptize and to bring the native people into the Orthodox Church,
Okay.
thereby making them citizens of the Russian Empire. also.
So as to solidify.
It was to solidify the relationship. And you know, eventually the Russians essentially abandoned it. But we'll talk more about it. But the but it was a very different. It was very different from how the Spanish missionized. You know, the Spanish came, they enslaved the local people, they made them build these huge buildings, the missions, and they baptized them, and no catechesis, no nothing.
So I'm curious about the impetus to go over to America, and was that coming from the church? Was it coming from any type of political, you know, like Catherine? Or?
It was Shelikoff, actually, who requested a mission, a church mission to come. He sent a request to St. Petersburg.
Right, but the colony had already been established for 10 years.
But the
In
church,
reality.
it was his request, I think, that brought over the
Right.
clergy.
After 10 years. So it's not like he was religiously motivated.
Oh no, he wasn't.
No, he was motivated by money.
Right.
And so, and there were huge numbers of seals and sea otters, and their furs were extremely valuable in Russia. And so that was the initial motivation. Then it became apparent that that this was not going to be just a, you know, come in, take what you can and leave. That there were actual, because the Russians were intermarrying, and so you had a whole society that was becoming a joint Russian native mixed society, and so these people the children needed to be baptized, people needed to be married in the church, people needed to have the Orthodox funeral service, the services of the church were needed. And so Shelikoff had a mission come to serve the community and to continue the missionary efforts that the lay explorers, they could only go so far because they weren't priests. So they could baptize, but they couldn't chrismate, and they couldn't celebrate the Eucharist, they couldn't marry, and they couldn't do funerals. So,
question: How did that look like? Were there just brave volunteers among clergy who just want to go to Alaska?
Nope. 10 monks were chosen by the abbot.
Okay.
Is that in Guam?
Yeah.
All right.
Elder Nazari.
And how does he choose exactly?
Well,
Lots.
Were you ever an abbot?
yeah, I was an abbot.
Okay.
He would say, "You
Okay.
have been chosen. You are going to go spend the rest of your life in Alaska, in the wilderness."
Was this like an honor or a punishment?
No, of course it was an honor. It was an honor, a great honor. And I'm sure there was some choice left up to the brethren. I don't know exactly, but I guess it was primarily the abbot's choice. It was a matter of monastic obedience.
That might have been their health and that type of thing.
Well, probably health too,
Yeah,
and
health and strength.
and abilities. They would need builders, and they would need
Right.
people who knew how to do all these various things. To, of course, at that time, people had a lot of skills. They weren't city boys who think that meat comes in a nice little package in plastic.
Need linguists.
But it's a pretty awesome thing to think about. What it must have been like to get dumped off on the shore of this little settlement, probably with a load of lumber. Say, okay, there's your church, there's your house, build it. You know,
Now,
and
are-
in September, you know, in September.
Better hurry up.
Are there any people groups still there who speak Russian,
There are.
and are most of them intermarried groups now, or they're not pure Russians?
No, well, there are recent immigrants,
No such
from
thing
Russia.
as a Russian theory.
but
Yeah, there
I mean, early on, like at Fort Ross, were they speaking Russian
yeah, probably,
when they first
yeah.
came, and the indigenous people learned Russian?
Most likely, especially if they married a Russian.
But that was the lingua franca.
Yeah, it was the Russian Empire. And in Alaska, it would have been Russian. Now there were lots of other ships plying the coast, you know, to buy furs and all this other stuff, and so there were Americans that would come through there. There were Spanish. There were English. Were the primary ones. There was a lot going on at that time, which and it's kind of hard to. Who would think of a large amount of ship traffic in Alaska in the end of the 18th century?
It's so close to Russia, as far as Siberia.
Right, but there's nothing in that part of Russia.
Yeah.
One of the biggest towns is on the what's that peninsula?
Kamchatka.
Kamchatka Peninsula, Petropavlovsk, and it's a long way from anywhere.
Would they travel by rail once they take it off the ship? Or
By rail?
yeah, because that's
There were no rails.
There were no
There's no
rails.
that time.
that started in the 1800s, at least America.
Yeah,
But-
this is the 1700s. There were no rails. No, they traveled by foot, and it's interesting to read about Saint Innocent. You know, he was appointed bishop of Alaska and Siberia. I think his title was the Aleutians in Siberia, and he traveled by reindeer back, by reindeer sled, and by a dog sled, and of course it was easier to travel during the winter time because in the north everything is mud during the summer and the spring, so the snow made it much easier to travel.
Huh.
But it was wilderness. It was complete wilderness, and a lot of it is still wilderness. There's nothing there. There's not roads even. So
Can you go up to Alaska now and find Orthodox churches?
yep.
Yes.
In the OCA has most of the churches. There's an old agreement between ROCOR and the OCA that they'll keep Alaska unified, but they have 100 parishes in Alaska. There's 2 Antiochian and 1 Greek, and most of the native population of Alaska is Orthodox. There's the Yupiks, who are the Eskimos. There's the Aleuts, especially the Kodiak Aleuts. Then there's the Fox Aleuts, who are on the Aleutian Islands, and St. Paul. St. Paul is an island in the middle of the Bering Sea, off like the middle of the Bering Sea, and there are churches there. Then Then there's the Tlingits, who are in Sitka and on the kind of what is it, the panhandle of Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the Athabascans, who are Indians living in the center. So, all completely different people. Yupiks and Aleuts are related, and they're little people. They're about 4.5 feet, 5 feet tall, with and they're very very peaceful and friendly and warm, and well, they're very reserved, but they're friendly and have great hospitality, and whereas the Tlingits, they're like 6'5", 6'8", huge. The guys are huge and built and very warlike. And then the Athabascans are typical Indians. The Athabascans are related to the Navajo and Apache. And they speak the same language as the Navajo and Apache. So, and then there's also Athabascans in central Canada.
So how would they say the liturgy? Would it be in their language?
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
Yeah, the Yupiks are the strongest. The Americans have done a job on the Native Alaskans. In the 19th century, there was actually an American government-sponsored mission against Orthodoxy, where they sponsored Presbyterian missionaries and Moravian missionaries to go in and to convert the Orthodox.
How well sponsored?
Well, I mean, they were provided with everything they needed, and the children were all taken and put into these Indian schools where they were forbidden from speaking their own languages and from practicing their religion, that is Orthodoxy, and things like that. So there was an American persecution of the Orthodox population in Alaska.
So we didn't have a First Amendment back then, did we?
Yeah,
We did.
yeah, this is...
So I know you spoke of Saint Olga. That was a Native American up there. That was a saint. Is there any other Native Americans that are saints up there?
Well, yeah, there's probably the earliest is Saint Yakovnitz. Well, there's Saint Peter the Aleut, who was worked for the Russian fur traders and was on a Russian ship off of California that was seized by the Spanish, and the Spanish, of course, the Russians claimed it was their waters. The Spanish claimed it was their waters, but the Spanish had bigger guns, and so they took the Russian ship. Of course, the officers were well treated, and in typical European gentlemanly fashion. But the Spanish horrifically maltreated the Aleut workers, and they demanded that they be baptized as Roman Catholics. Peter stood up and said, "No, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I've already been baptized," and so they dismembered him. Like cut out his fingers, chopped, and yeah.
Very.
So
So the rest didn't say that.
what's that?
What about the rest of them? Did they go like you did, or?
No, I think they were probably freed with the Russians. The Russians probably objected and left.
I mean, I think I'd go get baptized after seeing that.
Yeah. No.
We're
What?
back later.
Yeah. So that was 1812. Of course, Saint Juvenal was a Russian priest monk. Then there was Saint Yakovnitz Svitov. Saint Yakov was a Creole. He was half Aleut, half Russian. He'd gone to seminary in Siberia, in Irkutsk, which is on Lake Baikal, which was the nearest Russian seminary, which is like 4,000 miles away. and married a Russian woman, I think. Anyway, he ended up back in the Fox Aleutians, or Fox Aleutians, and as the priest, and served his parish, expanded the parish, and it was right next to St. Innocent. His island was only 200 miles from St. Innocent's Island, and so, being neighbors, they would get together.
Yeah, it's easy.
Yeah.
Swimming.
No, they had kayaks. They had kayaks. Now, the kayaks were made by the Aleuts for Aleuts who were 4.5 or 5 feet tall. Can you imagine what they had to do for St. Innocent, who was almost 7 feet tall? He was a big guy.
They did 200 miles on kayaks.
In the Bering Sea.
Okay.
It affected his legs, didn't it?
It affected his legs, and he was almost unable to walk for the rest of his life. After a certain, but so he would paddle back and forth between islands, and that's one of the stories. Is the natives? He found in one island, he found the natives waiting for him, and called him by name, saying that the spirits appeared to our shaman and told us that you would be coming to tell us the truth, Father John. Now we want to hear your stories and learn what the truth is.
Wow.
And the true religion. So that's one of the things. So nobody. I don't think they know the name of the shaman who had these visions of angels who told them about Saint Innocent, but Saint Yaakov, so he was half Russian, half Yupik, or half Aleut. Saint Innocent sent him at 50 years old, which was, you can imagine, 50 years old in that kind of conditions at that time was not a young man, right? Mm-hmm. Sent him to the mouth of the Yukon River, where Saint Juvenali had gotten murdered, chopped up, and he to preach the gospel to the Yupik Eskimos. Well, the Yupik Eskimos were traditional enemies of the Aleuts. So here he goes. He's an old man. He's going into enemy territory, and what's very ironic is that they later called the mission, or the mission and the town that grew up around it, Russian Mission. But there were never any Russians involved. And so he toiled there for 10 years, and with the Yupiks, and he would go around to the other Yupik villages, and he converted the Yupik nation. Then the Athabascans came downriver and demanded that he come up and tell them his stories, because they hadn't done so, and he better get in the canoe right now and come up with them. So they went 400 miles up the Yukon River, and he looked out. He was put into a house, one of their it's a dugout house and looked out and saw hundreds of people in canoes converging on the village. And he preached for 3 days, and then he baptized for 3 days.
Was this Innocent?
This was Yaakov Netzvedov.
How do you spell that? How do you spell his name?
Netsvetov. And then, so he was in his early 60s by this time. And so St. Innocent, seeing his, of course he also had learned Yupik and turned it into a written language, and then translated all the texts, or at least translated the liturgy and much of scripture. And then St. Innocent sends him to Sitka to work with the Tlingits, who are a people utterly unlike any he had ever encountered before. Totally alien language, totally alien culture. It's important to remember that the languages that these people spoke were as closely related as English and Chinese and I don't know, Swahili. And so so he learned Tlingit, translated the texts, ministered to the people, and he finally died there in Sitka. But he was an Aleut who missionized the Yupiks, the Athabascans, and the Tlingits, and so he's known as the evangelizer of Alaska. And that was in the 19th century. So in the 20th century, there was Mother Olga, but there are also several others that have local venerations. There's one woman who was a woman of great prayer, also from a Yupik village, but a little further to the southeast from where St. Olga was. And she would go out and spend hours and hours and hours in the forest in prayer. And so she's venerated locally by her. And so and there's others too that I've heard of. So the Native Americans are actually rather well represented in the calendar of saints of the Diocese of Alaska. So. That's pretty amazing. St. Herman too, who he withdrew to Spruce Island, built a little hermitage there, and lived there for 35 years. Would go into Kodiak. In other words, he'd have to row 7 miles across the strait. Not an easy task for an old man. So the Russian ships would come in, and he would talk with them and try and talk some orthodoxy into them. That they weren't just, like a lot of military guys that weren't exactly overly interested. So, but St. Herman was a great elder, and when the epidemic swept through, which would kill a third of the adults or a third of the villages, he would take in the children. He would care for the sick and the dying and the elderly. He was known, and then there's other stories as well. He stopped a tsunami. That area is prone to tsunamis because it's Mount St. Elias, which is right across the straits, basically from Kodiak. A couple islands in the way, but waves go around, and it's prone to these huge earthquakes, that whole area, and so tsunamis are not an unusual thing. And so there was a big earthquake, and people knew there was going to be a tsunami, and so they all ran uphill, and went to St. Herman, who was not exactly that far from the ocean, not very far up, and a quarter mile, but still not a lot of elevation. And he went to the beach and planted an icon and said the water will not come beyond this, and it didn't. So, what else? There's another story of St. Herman stopping a wildfire, or helping to stop a wildfire.
With an icon?
What's that?
With an icon?
With an icon. So
Maybe Californians would be interested in.
Yeah, we need some
Oh, yeah.
people like that.
hey, St. Herman's Monastery has not burned down despite all odds.
That's right. That's Platina.
In Platina, yeah.
Which is
Which is in the middle of
that far from it.
it's in the middle of a forest that's tinder dry most of the time.
So most of the evangelism of Alaska was in the lower Aleutians and down around to Sitka and down below.
No, it was certainly it started with the Aleutians and then it spread and then it went north. And they got about halfway up the state. And then there's not many people up there.
True.
Because it's too cold. You know, up to about the Arctic Circle. So, and it's Athabascans are in the interior, and Yupiks on the coast, and then Aleuts in the Aleutian chain, and Kodiak. And then Tlingits are in the Panhandle, who are the kind of, when you think of like Northwest Coast Indians and the, you know, the incredible art that they have and the carvings and the boxes and all of that stuff, that's the Tlingits. The totem poles. You know, they built these wood houses which were huge and long, and would last for decades. And so pretty amazing, you know, what how Orthodoxy came to Alaska and really took root. So, and we have Catherine the Great to thank for that. Or Catherine the First, second.
Is she called Catherine the Great?
She's called Catherine the Great.
Okay. Catherine the Second is Catherine the Great.
Yeah, she's technically Catherine
The Second.
the Second. So, it's 25 after, so I think we can stop here. Well, one last thing that I prepared for tonight, and that's, meanwhile, as all this is happening, you have a major revival going on the Holy Mountain. And they're starting in the 1770s at St. Anne's Skeet. There was a whole group of monks who started to push or to create a movement, traditionalist movement of a return to the fathers and a return to the Hesychast tradition. The Holy Mountain had fallen into a very kind of decadent state, and there were Hesychasts, and the tradition didn't die entirely, but it came close. And there were, and that's happened several times. Remember, this was also the time of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman persecution, and one of the ways that, aside from constant pirate raids on the mountain, that monasteries had to go into great debt, usually to the Ottomans. And then the Ottomans would get tired of all the debt, and they would come and try and repossess their property. And so all of the monasteries are built as huge fortresses. And sometimes the monks fought back, but for the most part they didn't. They just they counted on their fortresses to protect them. But anyway, so it was called the Kolivades movement because referring to Koliva, which is the wheat, the boiled wheat, which is made in commemoration of the dead. And according to the tradition, according to the canons, the commemoration of the dead is primarily done on Saturdays. There are a few Saturdays before Lent and Pentecost and so forth that are designated for the commemoration of the departed. But as now in a lot of places, it's become a more people weren't going to church on Saturday, they're just going on Sunday. So they would schedule the panikitas and they would schedule the memorial services after liturgy on Sunday. Well, which is canonically forbidden. And so the Kolivades were got the name because they refused to do memorial services on Sunday, but to keep the ancient tradition, and many other traditions and many other canonical traditions, and many other spiritual traditions. So the main leaders of the movement were Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain and Bishop Macarius of Corinth. And then there was Athanasius of Paros and Neophytos, Kapso-Kaldites. But the major figures were Saint Nicodemus and Saint Macarius. And one of the biggest issues for them was the frequent reception of Holy Communion, because people had fallen into a pattern of only receiving communion once a year, or 4 times a year, or something else, but not going every week. And so the Colivades fathers, in concert with the ancient fathers of the church, the ancient tradition of the church, advocated that everybody go to communion every week. Now they got into some big trouble for this, and in fact one of them, Neophytos, was condemned by a council of Constantinople as a heretic for doing this, and he was stripped of his priesthood and thrown out of the monastery. Well, after a couple of years, there was a new patriarch who thought all that was nonsense, and so he restored him. But they also engaged in a lot of literary work. So they wrote a book called on the Constant Communion of the Holy Mysteries, St. Macarius and St. Nicodemus. But they also compiled the Philokalia. And the point of this was to restore the essential traditions of hesychasm. And this is and which are contained in that book. It's a handbook for hesychasts, for spiritual fathers, for hesychasts.
This is 17.
This is 1780s. Saint Nicodemus also wrote a bunch of other books. One of them is the Evergetinos, which is sayings of the Desert Fathers. It's a different collection than some of the other collections that are available. The Rudder, in which he collected and commented on the canons of the church, the ecumenical canons. The Exomologitarian, which is a handbook for confessors, and the Synaxarion, which is the daily readings of the lives of the saints. So these were important books and very valuable in monastic context. They had there were other people who later on were associated with them. Saint Nectarius of Pentapolis, Cosmas the Aetolian, Nicholas Planus, and Paisi Velichkovsky. And Paisi Velichkovsky was an extremely important figure. He was, unlike these other guys who were Greeks, he was Ukrainian, actually probably Moldavian, and but he was completely bilingual in Greek and Moldavian or Romanian, as well as in Russian or Slavonic. And he undertook the translation of these texts, especially the Philokalia, which in Russian is called the Dobrotolubia, and publishing them and conveying them into Russia. In the meantime, he was gathering a monastery in which this was the work of the monastery, was to copy these texts and to print them. And so his first monastery was one of the skeets. I've been there on the Holy Mountain, but then it got too small, and so he moved into Moldavia and Wallachia, and where he was given large monasteries where his brother could grow and prosper with patronage from the local nobility. And he not only sent out the books, but he sent his disciples out to convey this message of this movement towards the restoration of eldership and of hesychasm within Orthodox monasticism. And so it was largely the influence of St. Paisivelj-Kosky that brought about the transformation of Russian monasticism in the late 18th and 19th century. Now, one of the things I found very amazing when I visited Alaska was to see St. Herman's copy of the Dobrotolubia, which must have been one of the first Slavonic editions. It was huge. It was a huge book, and about that thick, and it probably weighs 40 pounds.
And what is that?
The Philokalia.
Oh, okay. You called it something else.
But it's what St. Herman had with him, and is now in the archives of the Diocese of Alaska. Yeah.
So you said the monastery's job was to copy these texts. It was a common thing to have like a printing press at a monastery.
They were beginning at that time to do that.
I mean, the Gutenberg created the press when?
Oh, so that's 14th century,
Yeah.
15th century. So, but
it's a lot of work.
Well, at the
Page by
18th century.
page.
Well, in the 18th century, I think they had movable type by then. But you had to set each page by hand.
Yeah.
Like Father Seraphim Rose did.
Yeah, briefly.
Yeah.
But it was, and their inspiration was Paisivelj-Kosky. And so it was a really remarkable thing. One of the first monasteries that was renewed by the disciples of Paisivelj-Kosky was Valam at the end of the 18th century, which is when St. Herman and the other fathers got sent out to Alaska. But I can only imagine lugging a 40-pound Philokalia across Siberia, you know?
This is, you said that they're in Slavonic.
Right.
Here. Okay.
Slavonic was the literary language for Russians.
Because both Catherine and Peter I, they shortened the Russian alphabet.
Right.
They actually, that's another thing they're famous for. They didn't like the extra letters, so they simplified it. Because there wasn't 33 letters in this.
It was 37.
Yeah.
And then they cut it down to 34, probably.
Then the writing rules, I think up until the end of Roman Dynasty, they were writing the Trebiznak at the end of,
Yeah. Yeah, but the literary language was Slavonic. There was very little written in Russian dialect at that time. So, anyway,
Who spoke Slavonic?
nobody spoke Slavonic,
That's the thing.
but it was something that was understandable. Like
More or less.
nobody spoke
It's
well, but these people studied it. Nobody spoke ecclesiastical Latin either.
That's right. So when you say literary, do you mean also secular things?
A lot of secular things.
Or also written?
Well, what would people read? They would read the lives of the saints. They would read the scriptures.
They didn't
would
read
the
like
Psalter. Yeah.
fiction.
There wasn't much fiction in the 18th century. That really starts, I think, more in the 19th century.
Pushkin.
Yeah. So that's enough for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
It is truly meet to bless thee with thy tokens, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherub, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave his birth to God the Word. Truth their tokens we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Please go ahead to this.